Hi, my name is Sarah Montgomery. I work at CAFOD. um, I'm just really interested to know from the panel. So, yeah, it was such a really interesting discussion. Thank you. If we're thinking about the kind of double crisis that we're facing, so on the social side, we've got this massive problem of unemployment, like you're saying, and increasing unemployment, but also underemployment really being one of the biggest challenges. But then on the other side of things, we've got the environmental crisis that we're facing, and kind of increasingly pushing towards planetary boundaries, increasingly pushing towards a space where there just aren't the resources to sustain the type of work we're doing, the type of jobs, all of that sort of thing. So I'm interested in hearing from the panel, when you bring those two things together, how do we think about work, livelihoods, jobs, informal, formal, that really tackles the priority that the Sustainable Development Goals raises of tackling these two challenges together, of not just more jobs, but also decent jobs, also green jobs.
Brilliant, thank you. There was another question over here. If we could have the mic this way. In the pinkish top. Oh, sorry. Are there other hands that I'm missing? But there
Some
we go,
would
thank
call
you.
it salmon, but that's okay, I'll go with pink. Thank you so much. My name is Shauna Olney. I'm with the International Labour Office, and I just wanted to thank the panel for the references to the ILO. There's a lot that we're doing that's obviously very relevant to the work that's going on in this paper and in the discussion of the panel. I wanted to just mention, we seem to be discussing formal, informal, as if it's some kind of dichotomy, which it isn't. It's very much on a continuum. And I think this idea of pragmatism is a very good one, as long as we keep pushing the boundary towards formal. We may not get there, but we need to keep pushing in that direction. And Louise, you made the comment about the public spaces, and Myrtle, you talked about the home and how we have to protect there, and Convention 189 on domestic workers. That changed the whole conversation around domestic work. We are going to have, hopefully, instruments on violence and harassment in the world of work, and looking at groups that are more vulnerable to violence and harassment in that context. And I think some of the groups we talked about already today are part of that discussion. That could potentially change the conversation completely as well, and get it on the national agendas. So just a couple of things. The recommendation 204 on formalizing the informal economy, I think, is really important in the context of what we're discussing today. Hopefully the violence instrument, if it comes to pass and we actually have a treaty on violence and harassment by 2019, could be very exciting. And the issues that you raised as well, minimum wages, other sorts of things, are really about pushing along that continuum. So let's be pragmatic, but let's keep pushing for the ideal, pushing for what is really decent work and not compromising on that. Thank you.
Great, so a plea for pragmatism, thank you. Question right here in the front.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Michelle Chivunga. I wear two hats. I work with the University of Surrey Center for Digital Economy, looking at emerging technologies. And then I also have my own business as well as an entrepreneur. Thank you to the panel for the really interesting conversation so far, and for your excellency, or your points that you made around this agenda. My question really is very much around, are we creating enough of an enabling environment across Africa in terms of, allowing for engagement, but also allowing for education, as you mentioned earlier on, all across Africa. I know in Mauritius, we're slightly further ahead. But are we creating that same environment across Africa? And if not, what else can we do to really place an emphasis on that? Because I think it's really important we engage on the education side. And then also I wondered your thoughts around the new emerging technologies like blockchain and the opportunities that are there with blockchain. And then Myrtle, to you, thank you very much for your feedback as well. Really, really inspired by your story, and I'm also wondering in terms of what your thoughts are around using technology to really raise the voice around the issues that we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. I know I said three. There's, one over here, and then I will come to you later. But so one right at the back is straight in front of me, if that's you'd wave your hand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Olivia Cox. I work for the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales. Just picking up on a previous question about the global goals for sustainable development, I'm just sort of interested to know, particularly with Goal 8, decent work and economic growth, and gender equality, does the panel think that the targets are sort of realistic? Is your work aligned to the global goals at all? Forgive me if you mentioned them, but I haven't heard much about the global goals in your discussions. And just finally, I just want to say very, very interesting and fascinating discussion. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So I think we can chunk these questions, and I'm going to ask you to address part of it to start, and that is just the kind of the balance between pragmatism and not, and good jobs and environment.
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much for that, Sian. I mean, I totally agree. This is not about letting governments off the hook, governments and others, but it's the governments who've signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals, where the explicit commitment to get decent work for all by 20, all, underlined all, with a prioritisation for the poorest and the most marginalised, the people we've been talking a lot about today. This is the Leave No One Behind commitment, where expressly governments have said they will fast track and prioritise action for people who have been left behind. This is absolutely not to say that governments are off the hook from doing all the things that they need to do to create the right enabling environment to allow decent work to be developed. I would also add, though, that it's not clearly this isn't just an issue for governments. It's about the private sector as well, and the governments have to create the right enabling environment for the private sector. But it is saying then, how can you improve in the short term and the immediate term? How can you make the best of the work, the vast majority of the kind of places where we find poor and marginalised people working at the moment? And it's about, as Louise was saying and others have been saying, listening to what people working right at the bottom of the labour market think and want and need and prioritise, and delivering to those demands as quickly as possible, whilst also trying to introduce structural transformation, so you're moving jobs up the sort of productivity scale. So that remains the holy grail.
Thanks. I'd like to bring Louise in as well on that. Just I guess the questions of the balance between pragmatism and policy, and I suppose again the question of how this aligns with all the other objectives and goals.
Well, thank you. Obviously, first, the SDGs are an aspiration. They're a stretch target. In a way, they had to be. Who wants a target? Why should we have a target that's easy to meet? Countries have to stretch and find new ways, and not just on work and on gender, but as was mentioned, on education. The education target says it's no longer enough to have kids on the seats. They have to be learning something. So I think in all areas, the targets are really important. And as with the MDGs, all countries won't always meet the targets. And of course, the definition of decent work has some absolute notions, like it absolutely can't involve violence and slavery and a number of things. But then it also has some relative notions in terms of share of relative to countries' GDP, et cetera, and relative to poverty lines. So those elements are important as well. So will everybody make the SDGs? No. Should we push to make the SDGs? Yes. My point really is that too often governments, stakeholders, donors are really just focused on the formal sector. There is absolutely no doubt that low and lower middle income countries where I work need more private investment in labor intensive enterprises to provide better jobs. And that will take time. In the meantime, we have to stop ignoring the rest of the people. And we have to have pragmatic policies to deal with them. I think, for example, the movement toward universal health insurance and decoupling health insurance with wages will go a long way. Solutions have to be found, because it's a new area how to do this. Some countries are leading the way, and we have to, and they're not perfect and they're not reaching everyone at once, but we have to celebrate the ones that have tried something new and achieved it. Mauritius, initially, everybody said, how could this island country manage itself? Well, it found a way, it got the private investment, it grew, it changed, the structural transformation happened, and now it's celebrated as an example.
Great, thank you. Myrtle, I'm going to come to you. How does one, and can technology help raise the voice of those whose voices are silent?
The what?
Can technology help raise the voices
I think that, domestic workers today are very educated. And many employers actually give us a cell phone because they want to be in contact with us daily. So we actually, in our unions and in our federation, we teach domestic workers now how great is technology. With the result, that is how we're building our international federation. That is how we're building in our countries, our organizations, by putting messages on, on SMS, Twitter, and everything. Also, we see that we have a very good relationship with media. So whenever something is happening, and something is happening for domestic workers, like in South Africa, you'll wake up in the morning, you'll see domestic workers have a new wage. So now quickly you have to let domestic workers know. So we have a contact base where we have domestic workers on our cell phones, and then we send this message, and we build up something with Vodacom and MTN, and that's how we actually educate domestic workers in South Africa and in the world. That is the whole role of the International Domestic Workers Federation, is to educate domestic workers to speak up for themselves. But there was one question you asked me about the privacy. I think that is actually something you work alone. You think alone, you stay alone. You're not allowed to have your children, you're not allowed to have your husband. And when something goes wrong in that house, it is your word against the employer. And the employer always wins. Because there's nobody that's going to protect you. You need to protect yourself. And that is something that we're working on now also in the International Domestic Workers Federation. How do we actually empower domestic workers? How do we empower them to speak up for themselves? I'm still waiting for the day when women will just stand in front of an employer and say, look at me. I did it, they can do it. Look at me, I'm exactly like you. I might be poorer. And also the other question, why is there domestic workers in this world today? Because of poverty, because we are not educated, because many times there's 6 children and we are the one that must go out and work. In South Africa, it was based on our color. They couldn't classify us, who are we and what are we. I think that is also, and you were talking about education. Yes, we need to start education, but not education how to cook better, how to clean the house better, education to understand technology properly, education to work on computers, to drive, to do things. And then our work will be decent work. That is what it's all about.
Thank you. There was a question over here.
Just quickly a response.
Yes, sorry. Yes, of course.
About education.
My apologies.
No worries. I've just listened to Louise on the Skype there for the MDGs and now the SDGs. Now, if you look at the SDGs, the overarching messaging is that leaving no one behind. Now, if we are to get the SDG 8 addresses the world of work, but to get to SDG 8, there are also the other, including 8, the 17 SDGs, which will eventually create a better world, stretching, of course, ourselves to deliver on the SDGs. Having said this, one of the SDGs is for food security, for example, and I'm very happy to see Marie is here for Food Forever, driving SDG 2.5 for food security, but education. Now, you've asked a question as to whether, what is the system? We've always had education in Africa, but what kind of education was there during, I'll say 50 years back, because this, of course, responds to the post-colonial history of most African countries. The education that was given was to create a certain cadre of civil servants, but now are we empowering our youth? with the appropriate education. I mean, this is something that we have to bring on board all the time, because I was saying earlier on that when we have young children who are about to be born, they will be working in areas that don't exist right now. Now, how do we prepare these kids for this kind of work? Now, is our education system going to be the same formatted education we've had before, or are we going to teach kids to get out of rote learning and to empower these kids to solve problems? And in fact, last week, I was just listening to Jack Ma last week. He said at Davos that we will not be able to teach our kids to compete with machines. They will be outsmarted all the time. Now, what kind of education? How do we make these kids relearn or unlearn what they have done so far, so as to be able to adapt in this dystopian world we are facing up to? So this is the kind of thing that we have to bring. Is African leaders aware to this? They are increasingly rising up, waking up to this new reality, because Africa is going to be the youngest continent with a workforce of about 2 billion people. So we have this responsibility, and I'm very pleased to say that we need government. Yes, we need government, but we need also government in terms of enacting the right policies, so that when we have deregulation in terms of AI, the disrupting power of communication and technology, how do we bring government to bear to enact the appropriate regulatory framework that these very same people who are going to be trodden down on, but they will benefit from the impact of AI and, of course, artificial intelligence and all that comes with technology. So the downside of technology is that it will precisely be disrupting the world of work as we know it today. And how do we empower? How do we empower the youth, the regulatory, the government, and how do we prepare them for this new the new normal, as we call it? This is, I think, the conversation we need to have now. And again, to come back to the question of green, for all the old downside that we have, the negatives, I see opportunities coming out there. So there is new job to be created in renewable energies. But having said this, we are talking about the tax regime. We still need to see to it that people pay the taxes. We still need to see that corporates also bring in the average, the percentage, because when we talk about people's productivity, they need to be empowered with proper health, proper security of employment. So they need to have this. But of course, we also need to have funds for infrastructure. And until we get this recipe right, we will still be witnessing a disbalance in the whole world.
And just to say, I really like the point you're making that these are about productive investments.
Exactly.
But, too often in the past, governments have thought that expenditure on health and education and social protection, it's just an outlay. And I think the evidence base is becoming much clearer that this is about developing, a productive, healthy society.
Yes.
Could we go on the edge here? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ken Bluestone. I work for Age International, and I'd just like to begin by applauding the report, and which I look forward to reading in detail, but also the discussion, which is being framed very much in terms of pragmatism, and recognizing that rather than say that this is the aberration in informal work, this is a part of the society we live in, we have to come to terms and grips with it. And I want to call attention, in that spirit of pragmatism, one of the groups which is often forgotten and left behind in these discussions, which is older women and men. This is extremely important because the way we frame our thinking about economic activity is that we draw an arbitrary line in the ground, in the sand, that says that once you reach a certain chronological age, you become inactive, you become unproductive, you become dependent to society. And nothing could be further from the truth, because what we see increasingly across all sectors of society, across all countries, is that one of the things that underpins the formal economic economy sometimes is actually the unrecognized, unvalued, and unsupported activities, economic activity of older women and men. So, and Mauritius is a shining beacon in terms of having come to grips with this, but it's more than just providing a social pension, which we think is absolutely crucial to this. It's how do you provide also the conditions in which older women and men are recognized and their access to decent work is also valued. So the question is, how can we bring this much more central into these discussions?
Thank you, Ken. If you wouldn't mind passing along, there was another question just further. Let's take the, yes, on the end here and then at the back there.
Hi, my name is Pins Brown. I do various things, but I'm here today on behalf of ASOS, the clothing retailer, which sources in Mauritius. And I have a question and a comment. I'll start with a comment, but it picks up really what you're saying, which I don't think it's a very interesting discussion. I think everyone said that. But the undervaluing of what is typically women's, but not always women's, labour. And how do we, so the policy discussion and getting governments to do what they need to do, but it's still a leap to get people to see that domestic work and other home, it's not just pin money. The decades that, and I'm only 44 and I've been having this discussion for 2 decades. So how long others have been having it and what can we do about that as well? The need to just recognize it as work. So the conversation between you and your employer where somehow that person's work is work, but your work isn't work. And how do we need a public campaign about that? Could the ILO do that? I don't know. But there's something about the valuing of that work. It's work of economic value in the ILO definition. So I think that's my comment. My question really is, ASOS is one retailer, a big retailer for people who know them and others who don't, who are over a certain age, who've never heard of them. So that's a bit different. But they're one company sourcing in Mauritius. Mauritius is one country. You touched on Tirupur in India. There's all sorts of global sourcing. What does the private sector need to do about this? So there's policy for government, but putting in a minimum wage, great. Does that mean everybody leaves the country because it's cheaper in somewhere else? So my question really is, what do you do about that? That doesn't at least affect domestic workers. The house, thank God, cannot move. So that's one blessing. But that's my question really, what can the private sector do to support women and men in precarious employment?
Great, thank you. I'm going to take one more question from this block, which was slightly neglected, and we'll come back there in the next round. But one at the back here, and then let's go to the panel.
Hi, Emily Benson from the Green Economy Coalition. I just wanted to pick up the theme of green and decent jobs again. Given that governments are facing this sort of threat or question of how to better steward their environment and increased informality or increased workers in the informal sector, I just wondered, what is the role of government in actually generating jobs as well, not just providing regulation and policy, but in actually generating jobs? And I'm thinking in the context of the South Africa Working for Water programs or the India rural employment schemes. And I just wondered, what is the verdict on those kind of schemes where they're trying both to answer the need to better steward the environment and also provide jobs for informal and marginalized communities?
Great. I'm going to come back to our panel for this and ask for some quick volunteers unless you'd like to. But what is the role of the private sector? How do we deal with older people?
Yeah. Let me take on the private sector question first, because I think that's a really important one. Thank you for raising it. And the reason why I think it's so important is that in some areas, 50% of people working informally are actually working in the formal sector. So they're working for a company with a job, with a formal salary or a regular wage, or they have a contract. The ways in which we would define kind of formal employment, but they're actually working informally in that they are their jobs are precarious. They may be temporary. The contract may be a temporary one, even if they have a contract in place. It's not a full permanent kind of contract. So this is the focus on the private sector here is really important. Lots of the kind of policies and programs we talk about in the paper would be equally applicable to an employer of a larger organisation looking at the sort of more vulnerable workers within their organisation. But I would say the key one is encouraging worker organisation. Because again, we go back to the question that Louise raised, that Myrtle, you've raised, is really understanding what it is that people want to need, what are their priorities, and making sure that then you're allowing them sort of you're either catalysing, you're allowing them the space to kind of bring their issues to bear and to be understood what their needs are to be met.
I'll just make a quick confession here, because I think I'll breach 2 comments that have been made, one from Merkel and, of course, one of the gentlemen here. We're talking about the contribution of the elderly, and we're talking about the contribution of the workers. Well, I must say that I'm sitting here. It's been possible because of the contribution of precisely workers at home, for me, and also the contribution of my parents. Because if I didn't get, and of course now I still need people to look after my elderly parents who live with me. So I have to say that I recognize and I value, and I wouldn't have been able to do it if I didn't have house help and house support. So that's what I have to say in terms of the advancement of women in whatever area, whatever careers they want. They still need to have house help, house support, and if you can bring in, of course, the elderly through parents, and so I think we go for a better world. Thank you.
I'm going to squeeze in another round. There are some very vigorous hands towards the back over there, one over here. So should we go one at the back over there, two over here, and then perhaps three standing up? So whoever was number one waving vigorously at the back, there we go, keep waving.
Hi, so I'm Gemma Friedman and I work at the Trades Union Congress. So I feel there's a bit of it's been touched upon, but I feel there's a bit of an elephant in the room in a way, which gets to the quite a lot of the root cause about why the informal economy is quite so prolific. And I think that if we look at the public sector and what governments, particularly in developing countries, but of course it's all backwashes as well and stems from countries like the UK, is about the public sector and how the public sector as an employer, it's just decimated. The public sector is also a contractor that creates the jobs and provides for good regulation. And because austerity and neoliberalism exist in the way it does, again, the public sector governments, they don't have the power. So you have the IFIs in Washington who have been telling businesses and governments for years through the ease of doing business, and the chief economist resigned last week, I think it was, because the methodology of this was so flawed, that actually, the public sector is bad, and that regulation is bad, and that you get ranked as one of the best businesses, one of the best countries, if your ease of doing business is atrocious when it comes to workers' rights. So actually, it's fine. You can talk about informal being the new normal. It's been the new normal for a very, very long time in some ways, but in other ways it's perhaps unhelpful to talk about it like that.
Thanks.
It's much greater than that. Do you agree or disagree?
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to stop you there. Question 2. Could we have a mic over here? Is there just the one mic in the middle?
I was going to have a follow-up.
Sorry, okay,
Yeah.
Let's take you as number 2 then.
Yeah, thank you. So Andy Rutherford from the Asia-Europe People's Forum. Following on from what Gemma said, essentially 30 years of a committed discussion to do with decent work. And it's a deep sadness to hear the fantastic presentation from Your Excellency the President, that the situation has got worse, not better, over those 20, 30 years of this discussion. Poverty has increased, exploitation has increased, and the key difference we have in the discourse is Myrtle. Yeah? And having been proudly working with women workers' organisations, informal sector organisations across the last 15 years, without that voice, and without that voice being allowed legally and respected and supported by all means possible, then I'm a fear that the precariousness of work will only get worse, which is what is happening. If we step out this door, we have 1.7 million people on informal work contracts, official contracts in the so-called formal sector. As you mentioned earlier, the divide between informal and formal has been, it doesn't help us. We have to go back to the principles of work, decent work, livelihoods, and also the ability for citizens actively to organise for their rights. Without that, we'll be here 20 years' time and have a same and more depressing and sad discussion. Sorry.
Thank you, Andy. If we could get the mic over here, please.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Noble. I'm from ActionAid UK. We've heard how there's clearly no dichotomy between informal and formal work. And I'd like to point out there's also no clear progression from informal into formal. And we see this in many countries with large export manufacturing sectors creating what one would assume to be formal jobs, but actually because of competition between export manufacturing companies for investment, which serves to drive down labour costs, drive down labour standards, you're seeing increasing outsourcing and informalisation of what once were possibly more formalised forms of work. And again, this impacts women right across the board in many ways more severely. And so this goes, looking at taking a step back, looking at the kind of macro level, the international, regional level in terms of trade and investment deals. What can be done at that level to get away from this perpetual race to the bottom that we seem to be locked into? I'd be very interested to hear Her Excellency's reflections in this regard with respect to your region. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rachel. And we're going to take the standing up at the back there, a reward for physical labour, and then we're going to come back to the panel.
Thanks very much. I'm Caroline Ashley from Oxfam, once upon a time from ODI. And I know our Executive Director internationally is very glad to be on the Global Commission with you on the future of work. I just wanted to come back to the question of technology. My dad discovered electric light when he went to work with his mum, who would clean floors at dawn, and he flicked a switch on the wall and the lights came on. But I think we know that in the next decades, it's not just plain old electricity, it's a whole range of technology that is going to absolutely transform both formal work and informal work. We also know we need to get this conversation out of this room, not just from the people who've been slogging at this for decades, and I really appreciate the decades, but to people who aren't thinking about this. And we know from Davos and everything else we go to, people are thinking about technology and innovation. And we also know, I think, that technology will bring potential opportunities for informal sector workers, particularly domestic workers. I loved hearing your examples of cascading information, but also risks. If you really want to exploit people, technology helps you exploit them better. I heard examples from South Africa of an app that enabled domestic workers who are not live-in, who travel, to travel more easily to their next job, but it also gave their bosses the chance to rate them, and that increased the boss's power in saying, oh, you didn't do a good job, I'm rating you low, and that undermined them further. So I'm just wondering, are we doing enough to link the two conversations and be really engaged in the technology development debate, saying this poses risks and opportunities for informal workers, and we want to be right in there shaping how technology develops and having that voice in that discussion.
Great, thank you. Louise, I'd like to go to you with some of these questions and perhaps chunk them, and we'll come back to the people here. But I suppose the two big chunks or themes that seem to come out are it's all getting worse, number one, and two, we need the state to be doing more, or should the state be doing more, either by creating jobs or stopping outsourcing. And I'm keen to get your thoughts on those two controversial suggestions.
Well, let me just say that I work at research and work in low and lower middle income countries. So there are people who may think it's all getting worse in industrial countries, in rich countries, and that may be true. But in low income countries, low and lower middle income countries, it's not all getting worse. We've alleviated a lot of poverty, and we alleviated that poverty by helping people work themselves out of poverty. I'm sure the president of Mauritius can talk about what were the options for people 50 years ago in Mauritius and what are the options today. 50 years ago, they were certainly not science and technology and all of the things that you're pushing into and competing with in international value chains. Now, I do think that I think the pressure on private sector companies and global value chains to worry about the conditions of work in their factories that are producing for them in developing countries has really done a lot. In other words, I'm arguing for fair trade, but I'm also talking about the Nike standards and and for the garment sector, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's done a lot, and I don't think you've seen jobs shrink in South Asia because they've had to comply with those standards. That just hasn't been the evidence. Having said that, I think we need to focus on so it's not all regulation and all that makes everything bad. And certainly there is a role of both the private sector and NGOs as watchdogs for the private sector and the state. Having said that, I think we need to also be aware that there are some problems about power and agency, especially for women, but some excluded ethnicities, et cetera, that are outside of the labor market. And we can't blame the labor market for them. In other words, why do women are the biggest group that has benefited from the India rural employment scheme. But why do they need that? If the norms about women working were different in India, then women may have been able to get more opportunities. And so I guess what I would say is, let's make sure we understand what also has to change in society, and not blame everything on the labor force.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I take on to what just had been mentioned. We cannot blame only on labor. I think we all also have a collective responsibility. Just take, for example, one sector in Mauritius. Let's take, for example, the textile sector. The textile sector employs many women at all levels. And, there is also the regulatory features which come in from the market as well. Because if we, for example, want to target, let's say, the American market, there are many issues that we have to grapple with. For example, we have to ensure that there is no child labor, there is no human trafficking. So all these are built into the system as well, so as to regulate this sector. So it is not just, as you say, government. It is not just to labor, but there's also a social conscience. If you feel, for example, that so-and-so countries, so-and-so people are being exploited through this, I think there is this social conscience, and this is also is coming up quite increasingly. People have this conscience. They are developing a consumer conscience around products, around brands. So they have to wake up to that as well, so as to ensure that the practices and, of course, the ethical practices are being adhered to in this market, in these sectors. So this is also very important.
Not a race to the bottom, as the concern was made. We're quite tight on time. I'm going to perhaps just offer a few quick points on sort of what I'm taking away from this. Then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to quite briefly, perhaps just give a concluding thought, and perhaps take in any of the outstanding issues that weren't raised, and perhaps keep in mind the questions around technology as a force for good or bad. But I suppose the first key point that I'm taking away is that this is something that we as the economists need to be writing a lot more about, that I actually think we haven't been grappling enough with this. So thank you all for exciting me about the subject. I think the statistics that we're offered about the vast numbers of people, sort of 10 times more than perhaps we normally think about, is incredibly worrying. I think this sort of notion of being pragmatic, trying to get the policies right but without being dogmatic, is key. And I suppose, and I'm going to leave this with all of you as well, in your concluding remarks. The thing that I'm still not satisfied about is that, as all of the economists in this room will tell us, there is no such thing as a free lunch. And yet some of these policies are being presented as if they are free lunch policies. And I'd really just like to understand more, and perhaps that's for the conversation over the free lunch that we're about to go and have, over sort of really just kind of what are the more difficult trade-offs that one has to make. But that's more than enough incoherence from me. So I'm going to ask Louise, and if I could ask you to just give a quick concluding thought in a minute or so, and then we'll come back here again.
Well, I agree that there's no free lunch, but I think there is space for more benefits for all. By the way, I agree that technology can help a lot. And, maybe people think that things like in the US, TaskRabbit and the Mechanical Turk, etc., are terrible because they drive down incomes of home-based workers. Let me just say that I think if we had more TaskRabbits and more Mechanical Turk in low-income countries, that would provide a platform for people to sell their labor, and then they rate employers as well. And so they say, this person didn't pay me, and this person is this, and this person is that. So it has could actually benefit a lot of people. There's a social entrepreneur doing it right now in Nairobi, and I think it's for plumbers and contract workers, and I think it's fantastic. And it actually, the sharing of information about who you should work for and who you shouldn't is very helpful to people who are independent workers. Now, is there no free lunch? Okay, I think part of the trade-off has, sometimes if we make the excellent the enemy of the good, we really face trade-offs. And I think that has been the Latin American experience, rolling out too much social protection too fast, which basically raised labor costs. So that certainly is a problem that can be avoided. But there's some increasing study that I just read a new study last night about in Colombia where the cash transfer, the conditional cash transfer system actually allowed the households that got it to both members of the household to work more and to get more formal jobs. Now, how did that happen? It didn't specify. I really want to understand that, because if they got more formal jobs, then they're paying more taxes. So sometimes these social protection systems can actually increase economics, the whole economy. So yes, there are trade-offs. But we need to not assume that if we give people social protection, they won't work, their incomes won't grow, their children won't go to school. So these social protection policies are actually the most efficient thing to do.
Thank you very much, Excellency.
Thank you. I think we recognize that the informal economy needs to be structured, but I think the informal economy is already contributing quite a bit to the economies of the countries and the region. And I think that we have to bring awareness around this, that it's already happening. But how do we now empower precisely these women, because we are here talking about more women, how for them to recognize the rights and also the responsibilities as well, because these two go side by side. And at the end of the day, bring to bear that it is not a zero-sum game, that we have to see to it that it works for everyone. And there is, of course, gains to be made on all sides. But I agree with what Louise has said. We need to keep on working. All this, I think, is work in progress.
So I share Louise's techno-optimism with obvious all the cautions and caveats about the digital divide, and it needs to be managed properly because it won't by itself, the digital economy won't by itself deliver equity gains in the places that it needs to deliver them. But I think that there is nascent research that we're doing here at ODI, colleagues here carrying out, showing that there are some promising examples of actually power relations being flipped by the use of technology. And as you said, women being able to rate their employers, not just employers being able to rate you, for instance. I also agree with Caroline, your comment that it's great that we're all in the room. We're not necessarily the right people who need to be in the room to have this conversation. And so we're right at the beginning of planning for next year, Gig Economy Summit, where we're hoping to bring together kind of tech entrepreneurs, platform owners, workers, collectives, academics, policymakers, because we believe there is a win-win version of this. There is a model of the gig economy that benefits everyone, users, the platform owners and workers, and we want to thrash out what that is and what that looks like. So we do want to be expanding this conversation. On the paying for lunch point, I mean, we look at this point exactly in the paper. How are you going to afford this? Are you basically encouraging people to free ride to be working outside the informal economy so they're not paying taxes? Well, a few responses to that. One of the responses we've already touched on in depth, which is actually these are productive investments. We all benefit from having, an educated workforce, from having people who aren't living in poverty. I mean, secondly, it's also not the case that informal workers don't pay taxes. They pay indirect taxes. And in low-income countries, indirect taxes make up a higher proportion of revenue intake than in middle and high-income countries. So actually, that is a significant point. I think it's quite interesting, actually, that the IMF, I've scribbled all over it now, but here's the report. I hope you'll all read it. The IMF commissioned us to write this report, which I think is hugely interesting. Now, this isn't saying that the IMF is coming out en masse, all the executive directors signing up to this is some kind of manifesto statement that they're signing up to, but the fact that they're investigating this issue and they're investing in this issue, I think is really interesting. And they are messaging in their regional economic outlook to sub-Saharan Africa this year. They have said to governments in the region, don't only focus on trying to extract maximising tax revenue from informal workers. Why don't you instead look at how you can increase productivity amongst household enterprises, for instance? So they're actually, we can have arguments about structural adjustment and neoliberalism, but if we're being pragmatic, forward-looking, there are reasons for optimism here. And finally, actually, we look at this and we touch on this in the paper. There are some examples of taxing informal workers, micro-entrepreneurs. There's a scheme in Uruguay that does this. It's being expanded to other Latin American countries. But I don't think that actually it is necessarily a good thing to think about this sector, this vast group of people being excluded from paying taxes because there are benefits in paying taxes, not least the social contract is strengthened and you expect more from your government.
Myrtle?
I think before I give my final few words, I just want to say something. You might not all like it. But so many researches has been done on domestic workers. Millions of rands has been spent on domestic workers. What is domestic work? Is it decent work? Is it informal? If only those people can make that paper a reality for domestic workers, I think we would have been far in this world today. So my message is clear. Let domestic workers speak up. Let domestic tell you that we are formal workers. And let those researchers come to us and ask us, what is it that you want? How do you see yourself? How do you see building the economy? If only we can have that open space for domestic workers. And if that millions, last year 2.5 million was given at Italy to research. My question to them was, what do you want me to say to you here today? You have done it all. Could that money not be used to educate domestic workers, to help us to build the federation? If only we can have that. If only we can work together to uplift the domestic workers, because education is our freedom, and education will make us free to speak to our employers. So that is my message. Help us to free ourselves and speak up for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. So I've got a few thanks that I'm sure you will all share with me. Thank you to the ODI and their staff for organising this. Your Excellency, thank you for taking the time to join us, as well as all of the other panellists. There is going to be this networking lunch, so please do come along to that. And we've all been to sort of horribly boring panels where the free lunch afterwards has really been paid for in boredom and toil. I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists, because I certainly don't think we've paid for this with any boredom at all. So thank you to the panel.